and welcome to Contourcast. My name's Kat Boyd and I'm joined with my lovely co-host David Jameson.
How's it going? My turn this time.
We've got a special guest for you today on the pod, which we're both very excited about. It's from another podcast which you might listen to, Alpha Bunga Bunga. Really, I think I tweeted something like the only politics show worth listening to and got absolutely roasted by a bunch of other really nice podcast people who do Scottish politics.
One of the many great podcasts.
Yeah. Others are available. Yeah.
Others are available, but we're joined tonight with Alex Hochuli. Is that a good enough pronunciation?
That's fine. I'm not picky, and that's pretty close. Yeah.
Okay, good. So yeah, thanks for coming on the pod.
I'm delighted to be here. Looking forward to this.
So the reason that we wanted to get you on is because you wrote a great article back in June, which was kind of like very much one of the few voices that were putting forward these ideas. Is actually, I'm going to admit, it's quite nippy to be discussing this subject on the podcast this episode, because it's actually only today that some of my friends have started speaking to me again after I said to them that maybe white privilege wasn't a very useful term, like back in June. So I'd said, maybe that's not so useful. And at least one of my friends hasn't spoken to me since then and got back in touch today. So, apologies, I'm about to go into Coventry again.
Well, if I can do anything, it's ruin friendships. So, I'm very proud of that achievement.
So the piece out in Damage magazine, The Triumph of American Idealism, really focused on the global spread of Black Lives Matter protests. And it looked at how they show an Americanization of people, like almost like LARPing as American, and that it's all built around the concept of wokeness, which is obviously one of America's greatest exports to Britain. David and I have talked about that on the pod before. So yeah, we just wanted to kick off with a chat about your article.
I think that the reason that the article caught the attention of a lot of people was it was one of those articles that nailed down something that people were vaguely aware of, but didn't have the words for, or the right structure for describing it. Something people have been aware of for a long time. So obviously Black Lives Matter demonstrated that general phenomenon, that kind of political Americanization, in a very kind of explosive way, all of a sudden, all around the world, as you say in the article, in the West, but also even beyond the West, people were engaging in a form of politics which moved beyond sort of traditional forms of solidarity and almost invited people to reimagine themselves as actors in the American paradigm, the American cultural and political paradigm. And I think a lot of people have noticed this for a long time. I'll tell you when I first became aware of it, which was around the time of the student movements, 2010, 2011. And this would be in Scotland. And I noticed, what a version of politics that people would go on to describe as woke. There wasn't really the language, that language for it at the time. And I noticed that it incorporated both a body of political ideas, which felt very alien to me, coming from a kind of more traditional socialist standpoint, but combined that with a language and a cultural idiom, which felt equally kind of alien. So I'd be in like a student occupation of a university building, and there would be what seemed to me to be like strange rituals going on, people sitting in circles and criticizing their own behavior and criticizing each other's behavior. But also whenever they spoke about politics, they literally gained not so much American accents as that upward inflection. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And that makes me feel really uncomfortable. Talking about politics is
not okay. That is not okay.
It's not okay, and that's not okay, right? And when they stopped talking about politics, they'd return to their domestic accent, to the domestic way of talking. And at the time, I was totally confused. I had no idea what was going on here. What I didn't understand at the time was that people only a few years younger than me had grown up in a different cultural environment where they had absorbed the politics by social media. And in social media in the Anglosphere is totally culturally dominated by the American sort of experience. I mean, is this something that you had noticed long before this summer and the global explosion of BLM?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, David. And actually, what Kat was saying about perhaps the article putting into words what people had felt for a while, but not really brought to consciousness. I was in that same boat because it's actually an article that I'd probably been meaning to write for, if not a decade, at least sort of 8 years. For the same reason, actually, and I'm glad that David brought up that example of around kind of 2011, 2012, because for me, that was when I first caught on to something which seemed distinct. And it was, and I think the timing is really important. I'll come back to why, but it was around probably maybe just after the big student demonstrations in the UK. I mean, I was a student in London at the time. And what struck me was that suddenly, like on Twitter, on Facebook, you suddenly had these arguments about what was then the immediate new kind of woke orthodoxy, woke avant la lettre, really. It was not called woke, as you said, but of cultural liberalism or postmodern politics, or however you want to call it, which was around fourth wave feminism, I guess, what it's now referred to as fourth wave feminism, where I can't even remember what provoked the argument, but I was being, you get accused of, or something gets called rape culture, which, basically a sideways lascivious glance at a woman gets reinterpreted as rape culture. A complete collapse of categories goes on there, and the kind of hysterical rhetoric where you're not able to get a discussion going about what is actually at stake. And it was like, wow, this is like what I had read about, not experienced directly, but what I had read about 1980s, 1990s US campus wars. And for me, it was like, wow, this is like an American importation, stuff that I maybe have seen in movies or read about, but which is I'm experienced now in London in 2012, 2013. In fact, it's interesting because that it was maybe a year before Mark Fisher wrote his famous Vampire Castle piece, which came out at the end of 2013. And I remember when that came out, I thought, maybe this is the beginning of the end of what we now call wokeness, because I thought if someone's calling it out and putting it into words, maybe this is kind of, peaking. This is us being able to look back already immediately retrospectively and say this is something that happened rather than is happening. And I think the moment is telling. This is why I think the timing is interesting, because it comes, what happened a few years before? What happened in the preceding period before 2012? You had the global financial crisis, and you had Occupy, which, for all its many problems and many limitations, it brought back into popular discourse majoritarian politics, the question of majority interest against a narrow elite. So there are many problems with it. Even 99% is a problematic way of looking at politics that joins the middle class together with the working class and so on. But nevertheless, this was after a decade of politics being dominated either by kind of ecologism, where, no, you can't have more stuff, you can't aspire to a better life because there are environmental limits to everything, or to minoritarian politics of various forms. And so this was a moment of people going, no, it's us collectively together, it's the vast majority. And we have interests which are inimical to what the elite can provide and to the system that currently governs us. Okay, great. That felt like a step forward. And then suddenly that gets kind of poleaxed by this kind of new identitarian discourse in around 2012, 2013, at the time around kind of more feminist tropes or feminist kind of ways of interpreting it, which, today it's kind of race, which takes its place. But I think that the important thing there is one, the timing, that it's after this kind of seeming emergence of a potential socialist or left politics, at least, after a long time of abeyance, and the fact that it takes a minoritarian form. But I guess to come back to where we started, which is why Americanization. And for me, what bothered me, in 2012 and continued to kind of niggle at me here and there was that whenever this stuff came back, it was very American. And David's example is great. It's in the language that you can perceive this. And I noted in my article about how A friend told me how in Denmark they're using phraseology which feels imported from American English, which doesn't really make sense in Denmark. I see it in Brazil, where it kind of seemed to be kind of chic to use English. In France as well, and so that's one that already kind of gives evidence is evidence of where these ideas are coming from, where this stuff is being imported, that it's not something which dialogues with kind of domestic conditions and is an organic outgrowth of certain particular contradictions in that society, but is something which is being imported from the internet, really.
I mean, I think that's dead interesting. I also wonder if like part of the timing of this, like the ground politically has been made more fertile because of the ways in which people are radicalized and what they are radicalized around. So for myself and David and like plenty of our other comrades, we were radicalized primarily around the war in Iraq, on international issues, and also on the question of Palestine and the occupation in Gaza. So these were the two main issues that all of our political focus was on. And from the word go, you are bam straight into a lesson about anti-imperialism and anti-imperialist struggle and the like international solidarity is like maybe I would understand it, and the importance of that. So you're brought right into that discussion about anti-imperialism, which I think has created quite a different perspective for like us and a lot of other people who were politicized during that time. But what I think is interesting in your article, when it talks about international solidarity or the BLM protests internationally not necessarily being solidarity, it's not that I don't agree with you. I think that there are probably people who think that is solidarity, who think that they are displaying solidarity rather than just acting out their idea of like Americanism in do you know what I mean, subconsciously. Like I do think that people think that is international solidarity and it's a solidarity gesture. What I noticed really quickly was how fast the discourse in Scotland became about like one particular murder, the murder of Sheikh Ubayu by police in custody in Scotland, but it was framed entirely around the like American language and the kind of like woke discourse. Like it was framed all around that. And I think that true international solidarity has probably waned significantly. So I think that there's also a vacuum there, particularly on the question of Palestine. So, in the 70s, that would be like an actual trade union issue to talk about what is happening in Chile, what is happening in Palestine, the industrial links that are there, the Israel-Palestine being like a kind of weak link in the chain of US imperialism. And that would be quite a normal thing. Whereas now it's treated as a sort of like a fringe issue, talking too much about internationalism. Let's talk about what's going on domestically. So I just wanted to make that point.
No, I think that's right. And I mean, maybe this is what we can come back to, but the, internationalism presumes the national at some level. And what is evident in this whole moment, and, what I call the global BLM is just one instance of it. It's obviously something much wider, but what's notable there is the absence of the national in any sense of a kind of engagement and dialogue with national conditions. Which is what is really the biggest problem with all of it, and maybe we can come back to discussing that. One thing I wanted to pick up on is that you mentioned that 2013. I mean, we must be all about the same age, similar age anyway. That 2003 was really important. The Iraq War and opposition to it, and what was that was a real important moment in kind of the history of contemporary Europe, because that was a moment of the attempt at a construction of a European sphere, European civilization, or a European sort of way of conceiving oneself, which was built in opposition to the United States. So the United States was built up as the American other. And so that was a form of, for all that it was about, certainly from a left-wing perspective, about international solidarity, about internationalism, about non-interventionism, about anti-imperialism. It got wrapped into a broader mainstream project of defining Europe as against the United States. And even even in left-wing protests, there was a current of anti-Americanism there, which was problematic, a kind of way of essentializing America and treating the problem not just as one of American foreign policy and American imperialism, but one about the essence of what America is, that the American people themselves are, aggressive, too violent, aren't able to engage in dialogue, aren't able to have respect for other people's cultures, stampede over everything, etc. Right? Funnily enough, because that question of not wanting to stampede over everything, right, not letting this kind of American juggernaut just decide that the world is theirs, is something that completely disappears by 2020 with the global BLM, where there it's like, no, we're actually happy to be fully American. They've lost a sense of this outside. So what I wanted to do in the article, but part of it was not just remarking upon the kind of global BLM and the kind of globalization of woke neoliberalism, of woke politics, but also of looking at how this kind of dialectic of Americanism and anti-Americanism shifts over different periods of time. And so, the 2000s is a really important period where, there's a whole micro publishing industry of books about, Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus, all this kind of stuff. And a deliberate effort from Europeans, from European elites, from EU bodies and so on, to construct a European sense of self as against the American other, which is distinct both from the the Cold War European anti-Americanism and from what comes after in kind of the woke period today.
I mean, that's really interesting. So I was thinking about this before we started recording. How like liberals would perceive America like at the time of the war in Iraq. So one of the kind of like the famous sort of like liberal sayings was that idea of, I love the American people, dead friendly, lovely people, but it's the state I have a problem with. It's this policy I have a problem with. And actually now that has completely flipped on its head, like with Trump. Like I think the election of Trump really flipped that narrative, which was, no, the American people are dumb, stupid, violent, crazed, can't be trusted, elect all sorts of nutters into the White House. And actually liberals just love the deep state. Like look at the big love fest for like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Do you know what I mean? Like liberals in Scotland love the deep state. Like I remember members of my family saying, oh, I love the American people, but it's the government that's the problem. Do you know what I mean? And now it's like it's been flipped. Maybe Biden will rescue it.
So no, but this is interesting. I was thinking about this before as well, that the opposition, like in the 2000s, and that episode of anti-Americanism was, in the United States, you had the mainstream, the establishment in favor of the war, and you had rebels outside of it opposing the war, but it was a marginal position. There was still kind of widespread opposition, but it was still a marginal position with respect to the American establishment and indeed the American mainstream kind of in cultural terms. What is different about now, and about if you take sort of our contemporary Iraq war, which is to say American police killing black people, right, unarmed black people, what is the relationship there? There is a situation where it's not us maybe in solidarity with Americans opposing the American empire, but it's an identification with the American establishment against Trump. Trump being the kind of avatar of backwards American racism and police brutality and so on. And so that's a complete inversion. So before, it would be, you're on the streets of London protesting in 2003, as I was, and you're not in solidarity with the editor of the Washington Post. In fact, the editor of the Washington Post is part of the enemy because he's the one, kind of presenting American imperialism as a force for democracy, which is a complete inversion of what's happening now. Now the editor of the New York Times or whatever is an ally in the fight against American racism, against Trumpism, against all these backward American things, which we imagine are our problems as well, or something that we inhabit as well.
I remember at the time of the Iraq War, there was a moment because, of course, as you say, there was this European bloc attempt to dissociate themselves from the excesses of, American imperialism. And momentarily, people like Jacques Chirac became unlikely or perhaps likely heroes of parts of the left. I remember people marching with French baguettes, for example. But that, I suppose, a version of that sentiment did eventually re-emerge with the kind of people's vote type stuff. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you make about the national and the international, because I think an older tradition of internationalism has been kind of subsumed by this stuff, but it starts with a recognition of national peculiarities. So a perfect example would be the rise of BLM as a global phenomenon, but one which didn't differentiate itself particularly nationally from country to country. Also saw the decline of popular support for the Palestinian cause, which people forget. Only 4 or 5 years ago, there was a march of 500,000 people in London in defense of the Palestinian people. That campaign declined. And there's an obvious parallel there in that the Palestinian people, their cultural experience is extremely differentiated from ours. And elements in the media and the establishment have been very good at using that to suggest that one's association with the Palestinians must have an ulterior motive. In the case in Britain, this must be racism towards the Jewish community. Whereas Black Lives Matter, politicians in Scotland love Black Lives Matter, right? The case that Kat mentioned about Sheikh Ubaya is a fascinating one. So he died several years ago. And the response from the public was very muted, it has to be said. He was killed in a small Scottish town called Kirkcaldy. And it was only once the George Floyd protests began that campaigners used the momentum behind that issue to bring back Sheikh Ubaya's case into the popular imagination, which is very telling in itself, that you need the American lens to rehabilitate domestic racism. But it remains the fact that the most culturally structuring form of racism in Scottish society, because just reading through your article, you've got lots of kind of great snippets of national situations where the movement was imported into into national contexts where it shouldn't really fit. In the Scottish national context, anti-Irish racism and anti-Catholic bigotry has long been the kind of structural racism that runs right from the state through civil society, has been extremely historically important in Scottish society. And politicians don't discuss it because politicians want votes and electoral machines from organizations like the Orange Lodge, a Protestant supremacist organization. At the time of the BLM protests, a Protestant loyalist mob attacked George Square, the sort of main square in Glasgow, on the belief that Black Lives Matter protesters were going there to attack the statues, to attack the World War I cenotaph, I believe. It was never going to happen. But people in the media reported this as an anti-Black Lives Matter demonstration. Mm-hmm. Everyone knew what the real character of that politics was. But Scottish politicians, for example, and Scottish police officers, who would never mention something like the existence of Protestant supremacist organizations in the country, we're all taking the knee, we're all saying we are all George Floyd and all this kind of stuff. And it strikes me that this kind of politics creates a situation where it's very easy for domestic elites to get off the hook and to ignore even questions like domestic racism simply by parroting the kind of language and the ideas of American movements.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's completely evasive. It provides them with a great instrument with which to evade any accountability for domestic issues. Now, it's interesting. I mean, one of the major kind of recurring criticisms I got for the article was that, so what, in the sense of, so what if it, if something good comes out of it, right? If people are provoked into confronting issues at home, then so much the better. It opens people's eyes. And if it were only that, then I would say absolutely, that's good. And, you had a case in France, right, where the Black Lives Matter protests were tied to the Justice pour Adama campaign, which is kind of a long running thing around around, again, a case of police brutality. And so, and if it leads people to focus on their own issues like, brutality against migrants and, the European, like Fortress Europe, for example, then, so much the better, right? I think that needs to be done. But I think the problem is that it's not done through any kind of systematic understanding of what is actually at stake in those countries. And I think that's maybe the problem, because it gets reinterpreted through a lens which, firstly, is probably not really applicable in the United States, and maybe we can come to talk about that. But it becomes even more problematic when it gets diffused into different cultures where it really has no root whatsoever. So to talk about white supremacy in a kind of completely majority white society doesn't really get at what the real contradictions are in that country. It doesn't really unlock the key. I mean, I think you mentioned something about kind of being the key contradiction in relation, or at least certainly like sectarianism in Scotland, or kind of anti-Catholic bigotry being a key thing. But when it gets all reinterpreted as an amorphous racism, and not just amorphous, but one which is interpreted in completely idealist terms, where racism is just seen as bad ideas, something against, something which we're all against, obviously, but why, for what? What is actually the substance of that racism? How is it structured? Indeed, in many places, is racism even the right term to use? Like the Scottish example that you gave, it obviously isn't. It isn't an appropriate lens. So what, and to kind of relate it back to a second criticism, which I got, which is, what's the problem with, having a global civilization? We're all kind of internationalists, maybe cosmopolitans, for all that term now is so loaded as to, I certainly wouldn't want to use it. But, we want a global civilization, we're socialists, we're internationalists, etc. So what is the problem? What is the problem there? And the problem is not simply the homogenization, or the fact that we might be interested in one another's goings on, that we are interested in what's going on in the US, that we care, and that they might care likewise, and that that there might be a kind of interpenetration of different cultures and national civilizations, or not national civilizations, but national entities. The problem is that the ideas that get transmitted are not something like, Marxism being spread as sort of an idea across the world, in the 20th century, but is a very flattening idea, so the problem is not just the homogenization, but the homogenization happens through a particular content, which itself is homogenizing. So the notion of white supremacy, of the whole privilege discourse and all that, that itself kind of flattens out any kind of differences, and not just flattens out national differences, but flattens any domestic structures as well, so that racism can become a problem in any given society, and it's always the same form. It's and in a kind of, I guess, the ideas and the ideal type is taken from the US. So it's a white majority oppressing a black minority. So, you get absurdities like, I've even seen it occasionally in Brazil, but I hear that in South Africa, it's sometimes said, said with more frequency, speaking about minorities, in South Africa, which is a black majority society. So the structures that you're engaging with are completely different to the ideas that you're proposing. And that's that's what the real problem is. And that's what's really at stake here. And why I think the critique that I made isn't just one, we're saying that, maybe this is a bit dumb, but why it's dangerous, why it's politically problematic, and politically impedes us from being able to progress, is that it's kind of in some ways self-sabotaging, because it stops us from addressing what our real problems are, and diverts us onto this kind of imaginary, fantastic playing field, which is basically Twitter, the internet, the kind of global discourse machine of social media. And that's where we're playing, rather than in the real world, in our determinate national societies where we live.
Well, I think that this is where it becomes very interesting to me in the Scottish context. I don't know if you ever think about Scotland. Probably not.
Probably not enough. No.
Because like our nationalist movement, or the leaders of our nationalist movement in the SNP, David's right. Like, they love this American discourse about racism. Like honestly, like it's like very much adopted by our political leaders. And in my experience, so I lived in the Basque Country for a while. There was a real resistance to Americanization of their politics there, like within the left nationalist groupings, which I always found very interesting. Um, you know, being a big fan of American culture, I love jazz. What can I say? Um, but in our nationalist movement, like most nationalist movements in Europe have been co-opted by the right. Like ours is definitely like a kind of civic nationalism. Like the government we have right now in Holyrood is probably the most left wing that we've ever had. It was a low bar to start with, but it's probably the most left wing. But I see them as actively adopting this American discourse around racism, anti-racism, what that looks like, because it's comfortable for them. It's comfortable for them. It wasn't even that long ago that expressions of international solidarity or Irishness were essentially criminalized around that, like particularly controversial piece of football legislation where, you know, young guys wearing like Palestine t-shirts were being arrested by police, where songs about Irishness you know, would cause like a group of people to be charged. Like this is the same government who are doing these things, and we never really get an opportunity to expose those contradictions here. So I think that there is a place for like the left's approach to the nation state to be part of the tools that fight against this kind of like dangerous Americanization of our politics.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. And some engagement with the nation, I think, is necessary. In fact, I think if I have a critique of the left, I mean, certainly in Europe and maybe to a certain extent in the United States as well, is that it is founded, you know, the kind of contemporary, maybe postmodern left, that it's founded on a flight from the nation, that cosmopolitanism has come in to stand in place of internationalism. And those are distinct things. And it's important to understand that internationalism is based on solidarity, on each recognizing the other's struggle, but that its struggle is not necessarily exactly the same thing, but that that we're united in a struggle and pointing towards a similar direction, but from very different places, perhaps. And cosmopolitanism kind of assumes that we inhabit the same sort of space. And again, you know, kind of discourse mediated through social media, through the internet, kind of misleads us into thinking that perhaps this is all the same space. But the fact is that societies and capitalism is still structured to a large extent, and politics certainly is, at the national level. So a re-engagement with the nation, certainly with the nation state, and maybe even with the nation, I think would be an important step. I mean, it's certainly clear with Brexit, which, you know, obviously I've followed more closely than Scottish nationalist politics. Probably, I think more about the Basque Country actually than I do about Scotland. The Basque Country is one of my favorite places, so I do think about that quite a lot. Unfortunately, not as much about Scotland. But I think a lot of the problems and why the left stabbed itself in the foot over Brexit was an abhorrence of the nation, a retreat from the national terrain, and a sense that any engagement which is about us, about what we want for our society, is going to be de facto reactionary, xenophobic, nationalistic, and an ethnic sort of conception. And I think that's something that, you know, I tried to tie those together a bit in the piece, at least in reference to the sorts of demographics that were out protesting in Europe, at least from what I could judge and from friends in Europe that I spoke to who were able to give me a bit more of a sense of what the global BLM was like, which is that it's the demographics who are generally young, happen to be white, but obviously in white majority countries that probably doesn't say very much, but tend to be kind of well-educated, higher cultural capital, living in large cities. And that has become over recent years, over the past decade or something, a demographic that is probably struggling to a certain extent economically, kind of downwardly mobile, and therefore more left-wing than its antecedents were 10, 20, 30 years ago. But at the same time are more cosmopolitan and have a rejection of, a rejection of the nation, which for me, I think is really a way of rejecting one's own working class, of saying, no, I don't have anything to do with the nation. I inhabit this kind of global world. I'm a global citizen. Who are the people that you hate there? Of course, it's not explicitly said, because you're not allowed to hate in our kind of postmodern times, but there's always a kind of a coded hatred there. And it's a hatred for, I don't particularly like this way of putting it, but, the somewheres versus the anywheres. It's a hatred of the somewheres. It's a hatred of anyone who's kind of rooted in any way. I think that to engage with rootedness doesn't mean to say that we should stay in place. In fact, what I would be proposing would be that we should try to transcend the identities into which we're fixed, to not just be victims, but be subjects and be agents, to kind of get beyond the situations into which we're put, indeed to be internationalists and not to be stuck within the nation. But you need to start somewhere. And I think that's the important point. It's about starting points, not where necessarily you end up. And the starting point has to be an engagement with the nation, with that imagined community, which, like it or not, is where we are, is what we're structured into, is what we're socialized into. And that's something that can't just be escaped through an act of imagination, pretending that we're American in the specific case that we're talking about.
Are those like that kind of idea of like the citizen of nowhere? Is like that's the sense that I get from that. I think that you raise an interesting point about like Brexit. I mean, I think that like this was the issue that destroyed Corbyn's chances at the last general election, was on Brexit. The anti-Semitism allegations and the continual hounding by the media definitely played a part, but it was the Brexit policy. And, you only have to look at what happened to the Scottish Labour Party in the aftermath of the referendum. This is the party that's dominated Scotland for 100 years, completely wiped out, like in such a short space of time. Which is still, to me, is like a phenomenal occurrence that, you go from every councillor, every MSP, every MP, like just dominated by the Labour Party. And within a very short space of time, they are gone, like wiped out, apart from one in the 2015 election. But this is partly because the Labour Party can't deal with the nation state. They can't deal with nationalism either. I've always found that in the Labour Party, so Brexit, I think, is more about an Englishness. I think that obviously the vote in Scotland, I don't think that says much about Scotland, and there's lots of reasons. It's framed through the national lens. It's framed through the Constitution, so Scotland can't have a meaningful vote on Europe until it's independent. Like that would be my view. Like it's not really meaningful. But Brexit, and the way it was conducted, is really about English nationalism. And the left and the centre left particularly have always preferred to say that they are British, and the British Labour Party, even if it means invading other countries for oil, they'd rather say they were British than go anywhere close to Englishness. I always think of that Emily Thornberry tweet. I can't remember, like in the lead up to Brexit, where she took a photo of the white van and the England flag, like, look what our country's become. They're terrified of Englishness. Like the Scottish Labour Party, we're terrified of Scottishness. Like it's a huge problem for the Labour Party and the Labour left as well.
Yeah, I think the problem that Labour has is not even just nationalism; it's the national question more broadly. So what you were saying there about Brexit, this to me has been the recurring misunderstanding of the European Union on the left. In many ways, the most important misunderstanding is that for the left, for many people on the liberal left, they projected onto this their attitude about a cosmopolitan, seamless, international community of people, not unfairly and painfully fractured by dangerous national grievances. The European Union is not even a genuine transnational organisation. It's a meeting place for the ruling elites of Europe's nations. Europe's nations haven't dissipated. You used to get all these kind of things like Heart and Negri, Empire, it's the end of the nation state as we know it, and so on. One of the big political lessons of the early part of the 21st century is the nation state is still the fundamental unit of global capitalism. like the fundamental geographical unit of global capitalism. There's an extreme limit to which you can enter into a genuinely transnational form of capitalism. But in the meantime, when an institution like the European Union can be used to structure European politics in that way, what you have is 28 nation states, all with internal particularities, but also all with their internal class structures. And the European Union is being used to benefit the ruling elites of each independent country and to separate out the interests of the working class in each independent country. So Greece is a perfect example. The Greek ruling class, enabled by the European Union, using the structures of the European Union, committed a series of hideous crimes upon the working class people in Greece. That's what the transnationalism of the European Union actually looks like. But when the left approached the European Union question, it did so with this class blindness, which was fueled by their nation state blindness, because they couldn't see the individual national questions in each country. They couldn't see the ensemble of class relations in each particular society. They had transformed their view of capitalist society from one based on classes with conflicts, with inequality and inequalities of power and wealth and so on, into a binary question of the nation state as a reactionary institution, cosmopolitan transnationalism as a progressive ideology, and the clash between these two forces. But that clash was taking place only in the heads of the left. It wasn't going on anywhere else, and there's a lot of stuff like that in contemporary politics where the left is locked in this kind of twilight struggle with fantastical and dangerous forces like fascism and nationalism and creeping fascism and all this kind of stuff. And they have divorced themselves completely from the real political relationships, the real class relationships and so on that actually structure their societies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, that sense of being haunted, I think, is something that's so prevalent and so problematic on the left. I mean, I think even those who on the left, or the liberal left, who recognize the fact that the EU was no friend of the common man or woman, and that there was, and that, this is something that probably should be opposed, but, maybe not now, not like this, maybe further down the road. There was still obviously there was in that an evasion, and it was based, I think, on a kind of instinctive reaction against, especially in the kind of British discussion, maybe even more in the English discussion than the Scottish one, of Tory England, that this was Tory England's revenge, and that a complete lack of sense of the dynamism of politics, that this was a moment and something to be seized upon, that Brexit, of course, is not going to be even seeing as Brexit as a potential fait accompli, which you just accept as progress or not, that you make a decision on, but rather something that could be seized and led, was something that was abandoned. I mean, there was no conception of the fact that, maybe you do have Nigel Farage leading Brexit, but why don't you contest that leadership? There was no attempt to contest that leadership because it was treated already in advance as something that was an emanation of a reactionary mindset, and that therefore could never be seized. And so I think even those who on the British left who might have been convinced otherwise very quickly gave up the ghost and assumed that, well, all is lost. We can't go back, we can't rally behind this reactionary force and formation behind Brexit, because that would be to support all the worst people in British politics. I'm not even sure they're the worst people in British politics. They're up there with the pro-EU people. They're both the worst. But rather than seizing that as an opportunity for rupture, and indeed for a re-engagement with the nation and an attempt, a possibility, an opening to repaint a picture of what Britain might be, or England, depending on your conception, that ground was evacuated and completely abandoned to the right, effectively, to seize the Brexit point. Even to the extent that Boris Johnson, by no means a populist in any sense, and I was just reading something about an analysis of Brazilian politics and said, even a populist like Boris Johnson, like that, Boris Johnson's not a populist. The whole point is that the ground of populism and that upsurge was left so open that it allowed a patrician like Boris Johnson to swoop in and do this, let's get Brexit done thing. And then, I mean, he's obviously not a populist in any real sense of the word. But the ground was left so open, really by the left's failure to seize the moment, that it allowed even a Boris Johnson to kind of pose as a decisive and popular, figure.
I mean, I was going to bring up a theory that I have following reading your article, which is essentially the Black Lives Matter movement really rescued intersectional feminism from a very legitimate and pointed critique following, Liz Warren and Kamala Harris got the way that Liz Warren behaved in generally towards Sanders and the Bernie Bros and all that, but the likes of Judith Butler and the women who coined the term intersectional, Kimberly Crenshaw, donated to Kamala Harris and Liz Warren. And that Black Lives Matter actually, that happening at that point allowed intersectional feminism to not to rehabilitate itself, but it certainly helped dodge a very legitimate critique that it deserved to see. And what's happened is that it's just then reproduced the status quo in the democratic establishment.
Yeah,
that's my theory.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But I think maybe you could also look at it the other way, and not to the exclusion of the way that you put it, but also that the whole left, no, how do you put it? I guess the whole assemblage of postmodern liberal identity politics, of effectively hyper-individualism, resurges at exactly the moment when left populism fails. So, I mean, is it purely by chance that the global BLM happens right after, what is it, 5 months, 6 months after Corbyn's, what it was in effect, final defeat? Does it that it happens 2 months after Bernie Sanders bows out of the race? Now, there's obviously problems with the left populism insofar as it conjoined at the hip the two very different forces of a kind of a left economic populism with this liberal individualism, with the cultural left, and it never really, that confrontation was never really forced. It ended up sinking the Corbyn ship because the way that liberal politics took shape in Britain was not so much with identity politics, but with pro-EU kind of Remainer sentiment, and that was sunk the Corbyn ship that way. But for Bernie Sanders, there's an interpretation that the kind of middle class domination of the kind of Bernie Sanders campaign, and to a certain extent the kind of identity politics inflections of some of it, ended up putting people off and wasn't able to see Bernie Sanders through. I don't think that's the whole story. I think that the kind of reasons that Bernie Sanders didn't succeed has a whole bunch of other reasons. One of which, maybe just to kind of do with this, mention this as a tangent, was his rallying behind anti-fascism as the get Trump out at all costs. And when that became the stakes, not a transformation of American society or even just a rescuing of the American working class from the pits of kind of the pandemic depression, but also just a long-term decline. When it became about getting Trump out at all costs, then I think most like those Democratic voters, people who are registered Democrats voting in a lot of those primaries, which the ones which aren't open primaries anyway, voted for the safe pair of hands, an establishment figure to defeat Trump, rather than take any chances with a populist experiment like Bernie, in the way that they were willing to in 2016 against a very dislikable Hillary. But anyway, so I mean, whatever the specific national case of Corbyn, of Sanders, of also maybe even Podemos's entry into government with the centre left, which is kind of disappointing. It's better than the alternatives maybe of complete defeat at the polls, but really now being pushed into fourth place in Spain. Just a whole left populist wave being defeated, and whether people were conscious of that or not, I think at least those sections of those people kind of integrated into the kind of left populist assemblage, but certainly on the liberal wing of that, found something else to do immediately after its defeat. So I think there's definitely a kind of coincidence there, which is important. It's relevant, and it also relates to where we've started off this conversation, which was talking about 2012, which was kind of after the Occupy moment. What emerges immediately after this kind of fourth wave feminism which seemed to kind of come out of absolutely nowhere and was a kind of this kind of culture wars formation, which didn't really engage with what was at stake right then, still in the immediate post-global financial crisis years, with the beginning of austerity politics and the opposition to austerity. It seemed to completely not engage with any of the issues that really matter to people. And this seems to kind of repeat that process, almost as if like, if the left doesn't seize the moment when it has this moment, whether it's immediately after the global financial crisis or with a kind of left populist moment between 2015 to 2019, that immediately you get this kind of liberal specter, almost kind of cannibalizing the left immediately after.
I think that's really interesting. And I think that, and what your article does and the argument we're having right now, what I hope it does, what it lays the basis for, is to formalize, what this phenomenon is in ideological terms as part of a battle of ideas that more radical tendencies in the left can actually engage in. Because I think there's I remember all those, years ago in sort of 2012, as you say, being kind of exhausted by it and thinking, this is irrational. You cannot argue with it. Like, there's no way to defeat it in kind of formal terms, or even necessarily to understand it in formal terms. It was like mass hysteria. I remember thinking, even if it was only mass in the sense that it was taking place in circles that amounted to a few thousand people, that kind of, as the student movement was being defeated, it became more and more fanatical. More and more people were inside the student movement were being sort of cancelled and so on. Though again, that wasn't the phrase at the time, but there were rounds of kind of persecution and increasingly kind of paranoid views that emerged from this form of politics, and just thinking, you can't fight this. Like, this is an irrational human kind of impulse. And I agree with you. At the time that Mark Fisher article came out, I thought, it's ebbing. It can be broken down. And then these repeated resurgences every few years. I think we've talked about this a bit on Twitter, about how this is partly a condition of like the left being post-traditional, in the sense that it doesn't have the kind of organizational infrastructure that it once did. It doesn't have the same kind of levels of discourse between different generational layers. Like, if you could imagine being a member of the Labour left or the Communist Party or something like that in the 1960s and 70s, you would be in a direct conversation with militants from the 1920s and 1930s, right? In the last 20 years, in the time that I've been involved in left-wing politics, those kind of structures and those sorts of traditions have broken down, and that type of conversation has broken down completely. And what's replaced it is repeated waves of the same kind of failed ideas. They rise up, they fizzle out, they die off, and then a few years later they emerge again with no institutional memory that these ideas have already come and gone and failed. So a classic example would be like horizontalism, which you often find in tandem with a kind of very kind of identity moralistic politics. This idea of we can't have structures because this will lead to Stalin or something, right? That idea is a disaster every single time it's organized and advanced. Every single time without fail, it rapidly kills off whatever social movement has embraced the idea. 2 or 3 years later, another social movement emerges with no institutional memory of that total collapse and defeat, and rapidly re-engages with it. Thus, and the problem is, it's like, that's a self-cannibalizing tendency, because it kills off any opportunity to reconstruct institutional memory or movement memory or anything like that. And in a sense, that kind of really aggressive, paranoid, liberal identity politics does the same thing. It literally kind of eats its own children to such an extent that there's no one left to transmit that this stuff is a total disaster. And on the same level, I've never known it not to be a disaster. I've never known that politics to reemerge and not cannibalize everyone involved in it within about 6 months. Had Black Lives Matter in Britain had the opportunity, because things are very skewed because of the pandemic and the lockdown conditions and so on, had it semi-institutionalized and tried to continue as a kind of mass street level movement, you would have seen those same cycles of kind of sort of destruction.
Yeah. No, and you get these kind of like manic depressiveness effect, collective manic depression, which is, because it's so ephemeral, because it doesn't take any institutional form, which can give continuity to certain ideas, and to make those ideas confront the experiences of people older who are able to communicate those experiences, and actually kind of produce a productive dialogue, and indeed to kind of put people's feet on the ground and kind of make sense of the world. And you just turn up with a new idea and then you say, well, actually, no, we discussed this, 20 years ago and it didn't work. It's like, oh, okay, well, that at least, tempers my enthusiasm. And that, which doesn't sound good, but actually, no, tempering enthusiasm is important, because that precisely is a way of avoiding the sort of manic depressive sort of cycles that you have, where you need to seize that ephemeral moment of whatever it might be, because suddenly you have people's attention. You're there kind of arguing maybe with your friends or your smaller circle, your left-wing ideas, and no one's paying attention. Suddenly the world's paying attention because something happens, and you need to seize on that moment. Otherwise it'll all disappear, because it doesn't take any kind of organizational form. And when that starts to ebb away, you can already feel the kind of deflation of the balloon and the rancor that produces. And then you fall into depression, and everyone's kind of, just following kind of British politics now after the defeat of Corbyn seems completely like everyone's kind of depressed and falling back into all the terrible minoritarian tendencies, whether that be kind of horizontalism, anything that basically evades the question of power. And it's kind of ironic, because again, you have this kind of valence of exaggeration and then deficit, where there was too much of a focus on power, most likely with left populism, this drive to like, let's gain state power. You're not really gaining state power, you're winning an election, but let's take hold of the executive and maybe the legislature in parliamentary systems. Let's make a direct seizure of it, without really having built up many organizations on the ground to really sustain that. But cool, go for it, see where that leads to. Maybe actually holding political office, with the left holding political office, will at least open up new possibilities. Maybe they'll be able to repeal anti-union legislation, which will make it easier to organize in the future. Whatever, maybe something comes of it. It's a wager. It's a complete. They're betting on that possibility without really any sense of that necessarily producing the results that they imagine. But I think it's actually worth going for, right? But it becomes in a kind of almost obsessive fixation on gaining power and talking about elections, and which was exciting. If you remember back to like 2015, 2016, suddenly people are talking about actually winning, the left actually winning. It's like, well, this is great. This is not the left wallowing in its own marginality, creating ever newer subcultures, kind of satisfied in its alterity, while at the same time, lamenting the fact that not really able to go anywhere, and therefore remaining in this relationship where authority effectively, the establishment is always in power, and we're always saying, hey, fuck you, and just kind of remaining in that kind of adolescent relationship with regard to political power. Hey, that's being overcome, and now we're re-engaging with political power. We're talking about winning elections. We're talking about what we might do and what policies we might enact, and it became almost a too narrow fixation on kind of not just electoral politics. I don't want to be seen to be critical of electoral politics, but on politics in the narrow sense of the word, in terms of the kind of agencies and offices of state, as the kind of sum total of politics. And so again, that's another sense where you get a kind of an exaggeration and then a recession. Again, it's like a wave coming in and out. And it's actually not by chance that one of the sections in the Alpha Bunga Bunga book is actually, we called it the wave pool, because it exactly is that. It's like you're like one of these aqua parks or whatever, right, where you have a wave pool, and so you get another big wave coming, and it crashes, and then actually not only is it just a repeated sequence of a wave cresting and crashing, which can be demoralizing enough, but unlike in nature, where a wave, the succession of waves crashing against the shore actually transforms the shore. There's an actual geological kind of impact. In a wave pool, nothing happens, because it's constructed just to kind of keep going over and over in the simulation of politics, but nothing actually ever changes.
I was going to ask if you wanted to plug the book, but you've done it.
But I just wanted to.
Very, very interesting. Like, think we've been recording for about an hour now, and we got a lot of flack for putting up a 2-hour podcast. So we should probably close it there. David, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add.
No, just that I think all that stuff's really interesting. I'm looking forward to reading the book because I think this is an interesting project. In terms of like the psychological landscape of our politics, and it's something we've discussed in this podcast a few times about the almost kind of chemical nature of modern politics, of those highs and those lows being sucked into a kind of ephemeral media cycle of catastrophes and happenings that ultimately aim, just reproduce, a very similar paradigm of political events as the one that preceded it. And I think that there's a longer conversation to have about how you break those cycles and establish, a more meaningful political trajectory. And so, yeah, I'm just, glad that conversation is going on, and it'd be good to explore it again in future, I suppose.
When is your book?
So the book will be out on the 25th of June. So it's still a little while away, about 7 months away. But there's links on our social media and so on, and we'll be trailing it extensively in the lead up to it coming out. But the book itself is a way of kind of bringing together all of the discussions that we had on BungaCast over the past 3-4 years now, and to kind of give that a kind of written form, to move beyond the kind of ephemerality of of discussing things on a podcast and actually give it some slightly more permanent form, which I think is a good ambition in general.
Yeah, I agree. And would love to have you back on closer to the time, or any of your other friends from the podcast.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much for joining us tonight. We should sum up. David, do we have any announcements? ConnorCast related announcements?
We're going to try and have a rapid fire of podcasts coming out before Christmas. So look forward to that promise being abandoned.
Broken.
Yeah, being broken between here and now. Just to say to subscribe to the YouTube account, to the SoundCloud account, just subscribe generally, share it generally. That's all, I think. We don't have a book to announce at this point. Maybe one day, you never know. But yeah, just do share.